Hi, welcome to part two of the lecture on the philosophy of mind. We left off part one by talking about identity theory. Um, I want to pick up with eliminative materialism, which is a kind of a clunky word. It means it's a materialist philosophy. When I say it's a physicalist approach that tries to eliminate certain ways of thinking about the phenomenon of the mind. So it is a type of physicalism. There are a number of people who are physicalists. Two of the more prominent ones are Patricia Churchland and Paul Churchland, her husband, and that's why we're reading the book Touching a Nerve. They suggest, by the way, they don't use the word eliminative materialism recently. In fact, Patricia Churchland's more likely to talk about neurophilosophy, which is a phrase that she coined, as you know from having read the first couple chapters there. But to say that mental states are equal to brain states, which is what identity theory does, they suggest, is a flaw. They argue even something stronger. Mental states per se do not exist at all. All we have are brain states. Let's just talk about brain states. If you think back to the very beginning of the Churchland book, she says, "Myself is my brain. I am the way I am because my brain is the way that it is." Brain equals self. Brain makes the mind. In that particular work, she doesn't go so far as to say, let's eliminate, our common sense vocabulary. She still says it's okay to use the word self and mind if you want to, but know that you're kind of engaging in metaphors. What we're really talking about are a series of phenomena that are located in the brain. Our ordinary common sense view of the mind, physicalists argue, like many of our common sense notions of the world, is simply wrong. They call it folk psychology. We need instead a more neuroscience-based vocabulary. And we'll talk more about Churchland, and you'll be reading more about Churchland, so I'm going to go quickly past any greater details in this, because this is one of the contemporary approaches that's still on the table and still very actively being pursued by philosophers like Churchland. Another theory that is still on the table and being widely discussed and debated is functionalism. And the functionalists say that the mind is analogous to a computer. Functionalism, as you imagine, goes to the beginnings of cognitive science. I'm sorry, of computer science, of artificial intelligence, in the 1940s and 1950s. Proponents here include people like Alan Turing. You may know Turing from the movie a few years ago, The Imitation Room. Jerry Fodor, Marvin Minsky, who founded the AI lab at MIT, and the philosopher Hilary Putnam. So the advocates tend to come from artificial intelligence, computer science fields, as well as philosophy. They say the mind is not a thing. Don't think of the mind as a thing. Think of it as a series of functions. What they do, more precisely, I'll break it down for you. The mind's not a thing but a system. What's a system? That's a good question. A system is an ensemble of components with a particular function in mind. Okay, what's a function? A function can be described in terms of what it gets done in the actual world. That's a very nice way of breaking it down. That's where the rubber meets the road. The mind is a system that has a function, and the function is it accomplishes things in the world. In other words, it helps us navigate the surface of the earth as humans, helps us get through our life. And the mind is this system of components. And so functionalism has been one of the more important developments, over the last 40 to 50 years. In particular, I just want to note one thing that Turing wrote about. He came up with this idea of the Turing machine, but also that of the Turing test. If a computer can perform in such a way that an expert can't distinguish its performance from human performance, then we have to conclude that that particular machine is thinking, the thinking machine, and that it is intelligent. And think about that. If something could convince an expert, or can convince you or I, that it's a human being and not a machine, then maybe, just maybe, we have to acknowledge that computers are thinking. John Searle is a noted critic of this. We'll take a look at his view momentarily. So that's computer functionalism. Related to computer functionalism is what's known as the computational theory of mind. A computation computer, you can see that connection there. And it's very important in cognitive science today. I am not going to get into the computational theory of mind. I mention it only because I know some students are interested in psychology and cognitive science, and some people are very interested in artificial intelligence and computers. So if you think about computationalism, you are working in a subset of functionalism. That's the philosophy of mind that you're working within. There's a lot of noteworthy, proponents of this view today. Steven Pinker, professor at MIT, is one of them. I use Steven Pinker's books in one of my other classes. He's known for arguing that we have a language instinct. This is not unique to him. This is something that the linguist Noam Chomsky argued in the 1950s. He argues also that we are not blank slates, that on which experience inscribes its knowledge, but we are in fact hardwired for certain forms of cognition. So computational theory of mind, subset of functionalism. And now I want to turn my attention to John Searle, who kind of has his own approach to things. He's, and if you could refer to that article that I had you read by him, you'll remember how he talks about this micro-macro distinction. He uses this micro-macro analogy to not, solve the mind-body dualism problem as much as to dissolve it, just to render it, without any merit. He talks about the liquidity of water. So let's take, for example, this bottle of water I have here. It's liquid. Its liquidity, though, is at the macro level. If I pull out one water molecule, I can't pull it out and say, here, this one molecule of H2O is wet. Wetness, or liquidity, is a feature of many millions of water molecules together. Maybe I have a droplet or a teaspoonful. Same thing with this table. I can't reach in and pull out one molecule that makes up this table and say, here is solidity. I can't go to my window and pull out one molecule of glass and say, here's transparency. Transparency, solidity, liquidity, wetness, these are properties of things at the macro level. At the micro level, all you do is have one particular molecule. Surface features, he says, are caused by the behavior of elements at the micro level. It's the same thing, he says, with the mind and the body. I can't reach into one person's brain, pull out one neuron and say, voila, here's consciousness, here's mind. It's ridiculous. But if I pulled out many billions of neurons, I might be able to talk about cognition, about mind. So in the same way that one neuron does not a mind make, in the same way that one molecule of water, makes for a bottle of water, we can start thinking in terms of a micro-macro distinction. So this is a very interesting idea. We'll talk later on, next couple lectures down the road, about something called emergence and the emergentist thinking. Searle's not an emergentist thinker, but he's really arguing something very similar to emergence here, that somehow mind emerges from the physical nature, but it's not always reducible to that. So he's very close to emergentism, although he doesn't call himself that. So that's a very interesting way to look at the mind-body problem. Maybe this whole thing is kind of artificial. Brains do minds, the way stomachs do digestion, the way water molecules do liquidity when there are many of them. He calls his approach biological naturalism. That was earlier in his career. He doesn't really use the phrase all that much more recently. Basically, mental phenomena are caused by processes in the brain. It's very similar to what the identity theorist said, But he says conscious experience is not reducible to physical states. they're unique, they're special. That, we can analyze conscious experience, whether it's looking at a painting, or talking about human emotion, and or talking about the beauty of mathematics or the beauty of a piece of music. It's not reducible to certain brains to physical states. So we can talk more about this after you've seen the little video. That's John Searle. By the way, Searle is a critic of all forms of materialism. He's not a dualist. He's not a dualist at all. He does criticize materialism, and that would include identity theory, eliminative materialism, and functionalism. They're all forms of materialism or physicalism because they aspire to explain the mind by reference to some sort of a physical state. So he ends up concluding in that little video clip I would like you to see that consciousness is not reducible to physical states. If I consciously think that I'm conscious, then I'm conscious. That's the end of the story right there. As far as being a critic of materialism, he's especially noted for his critique of strong AI, strong artificial intelligence. And he developed this thought experiment. It wasn't a real physical experiment, it was a thought experiment, called the Chinese Room thought experiment. So he says, supposing hypothetically it's a language I don't speak, and for Searle it was Chinese. He didn't speak Chinese. So he says, imagine a group of people inside of a room, okay? They have no knowledge of Chinese, but they have a rule book on how to manipulate symbols that are in Chinese. So outside, the door, there's somebody who knows Chinese who slips them a note under the door in Chinese. The people in the group get together. They look at the rule book and they see that when they see a symbol like this, they can respond this way or that way or some other way. But these are the possible responses. So they respond. They put the note back outside the door. The person says, oh, look at that. The person in the room knows how to speak Chinese. So they respond back again. They slide it into the door. The people look at it, and they respond using their rule book, slide it back out the door. You could actually convince, says Searle, the person who's outside the door that the people inside the room knew Chinese, even though they don't know Chinese at all. Why does he use the Chinese Room thought experiment? He says, well, this is how computers operate. He says that computers don't have semantics. They have syntax. They're very good at manipulating rules, like grammar. Grammar is an example of syntax. But they don't have any clue as to what the meaning of the phrase is. Semantics means you attach the meaning to a word or to a statement. So he says, because computers will deal at the level of syntax, not semantics, they are not capable of true thought. Not everybody agrees with Searle, by the way. So Searle's essay that came out a few decades ago generated lots and lots of responses, and people still debate the Chinese Room thought experiment up to today. But here's a good thing for you to think about. Does your computer understand you? Would you say it's understanding you when it says good morning? You could program it to say good morning. Or that it tells you it has a low battery? Is it just following certain algorithms and certain rules? Is it just following a program? I think most of us would agree that it's just kind of following what it's been taught to do, giving a certain algorithm, a certain decision tree of modeling. But there are some other things to consider here. I'm stepping away from Searle. I'm just trying to think outside the box a little bit. Maybe humans are also just following programs, Maybe we have a certain neurological syntax. Who's to say that our responses, verbal or otherwise, are not just based upon a limited set, although it's a very large set, it is a limited set of possible responses. Why do we think they were so much grander than computers? Another question, can we imagine someday a computer, that would convince us that it was thinking? And here I'm thinking of a number of science fiction, movies that deal with this area. I, Robot's one of my favorites, but there are many others as well. Let's suppose that we agree that a computer can think, either now or someday. Can it ever be conscious? So consciousness is a whole other thing. Suppose I admit, my computer is very smart. Well, the computer of the future is very smart. can we then say that it has consciousness similar to human consciousness? Now, the functionalists come back and they say, yes, there is a specific kind of qualia that this computer would have. It would be the qualia of artificial intelligence, not the qualia of a person. But this is kind of where the debate is right now. We have not moved beyond that particular area. There's a few other views I just want to point attention to before we wrap up. Daniel Dennett, he's the professor at Tufts University I talked about earlier, who talks about computationalism and things. One thing that's interesting, he says, is what we think of as the stream of consciousness in our minds is not a single unified sequence at all, but it's a series of what he calls multiple drafts. One draft or another draft after another draft, like you write different drafts of an essay, for example. Different drafts of reality. The mind is constantly updating, and we experience this as a sequence. But there is no unified self behind all of that. There's no one place where it all comes together. And this is consistent with the idea that the mind is sort of like a computer function. It's also consistent with many of the findings of neuroscience and cognitive science as well. Now, there's some critics as well. David Chalmers, Australian philosopher, very interesting. He says there are two concepts of mind we need to keep in mind. The phenomenal realm, which is the conscious experience, and which includes also a mental state of consciously experienced reality. He says this phenomenal realm is characterized by what it feels. Being conscious and self-aware feels like a certain thing. It's similar to what one might say is qualia, right? The second concept of mind, he says, is the psychological. And this is the mind as the cause or the explanation for certain behaviors. Why did you build that bridge? Why did you, drive, to the West Coast? Why do you do anything in the course of a day? This psychological mind is characterized by what it does. And so building upon this idea that we have these two different aspects of how we use the word mind, he concludes that physicalism, or the materialist explanation, like Churchland and like the functionalists and like the identity theorists, they can explain the easy problems of consciousness, like perception, cognition, how learning occurs. But physicalism cannot explain the hard problem of consciousness. He's famous for this phrase, the hard problem of consciousness. In other words, why we have this feeling of self-awareness in the first place. That is something that physicalism has not been able to do. Instead, Chalmers develops a kind of dualism in his thinking. Churchland and Searle also, and many others disagree with Chalmers, but there is another view out there. Not all philosophers agree that physicalism is the final explanation of where we're going. Thomas Nagel, the fellow who authored What It's Like to Be a Bat, wrote a very provocative book about back in 2012, where he challenged physicalism, and he says, physicalist approaches, have failed to explain consciousness and to explain things like meaning and value. And he says, this is not just a small matter of how the mind and the brain work together. That would be significant by itself. He says, instead, this is, in fact, the key to understanding the cosmos itself. It goes back to what Bertrand Russell was saying about, the mind in reality, as far as the value of philosophy. We have, again, two kinds of stuff in the world. And physicalism does not explain the uniqueness of consciousness. And scientific reduction, whether it's neo-Darwinian thinking or whatever, has failed to explain the physical world, how the physical world results in consciousness. So there are some dissenting voices out there. I've posted a few paragraphs from both Nagel and Chalmers for you to look at. There's another issue that comes up. This is not a different opinion, it's just a different issue that's kind of interesting sometimes when we talk about philosophy of mind. In a certain way, we have always known that the physical affects the mental, that the brain in its chemistry affects the mind, which Descartes probably should have realized even hundreds of years ago. The chemicals in coffee make me more alert. Beer can make somebody drunk. We all are aware blood sugar can change people's behavior. We all know that chemicals in the chemical balance in the brain, hormones, and other things affect behavior and affect the mind. We also know that the mental can affect the physical. My mind can decide to pick up my water bottle and move from here to here and back to over here again. It's not a very profound thing, but it is a mental event that's causing a change in the physical world. Well, where am I going with this? Well, it's very interesting to see how this mind-body issue plays out in contemporary psychiatry. Peter Kramer is a psychiatrist, which means he's an MD. Back in the early 1990s, wrote a book called Listening to Prozac. He was one of the first psychiatrists to prescribe Prozac, and he wrote about it because he has a very strong philosophical bent. He noted how medication was redefining what's essential about our sense of self and what's contingent in our personalities. If you can change somebody's personality by changing the chemistry of the brain, wow, that means that, brain chemistry changes who we are. It means that our personality itself, the thing that makes us most unique, is much more malleable and shapeable than we had thought previously. So I just want to toss that out there as another area to think about this. It goes to show that the mind-body dualism problem, really is resolvable once we recognize that our brains are chemicals and they're also electrical, and plus we have to look at the role of all the different, hormones and neurotransmitters in our brain. And that's kind of where the starting point is with Patricia Churchland's book, because she's very well steeped in neuroscience as well as in philosophy. Final thoughts. Where are we going with this? Well, just want to point out one thing. There are dualists out there. Not just Chalmers, but maybe some of you are dualists. If someone believes that there is a soul that goes on after the death of the brain, then that's a form of dualism. And I'm not talking about, somebody says, well, after I die, my body goes back into the ground and, I get regenerated, I'm not suggesting that. It's not useful to think that, our mind our body breaks down, we become fertilizer. For us to have a meaningful idea of a soul that goes on after our existence is over, we want to kind of preserve this idea of our personal biography goes on, that our mind still recalls certain events. And this is kind of essential to what Churchland talks about in 2 of her chapters about the idea of a soul. Physicalism does challenge the idea of an enduring soul. My second set of final thoughts. Well, my own view kind of derives from John Searle and Patricia Churchland, Daniel Dennett. I like all of them. I don't agree with everything they say, but I kind of come from their perspective. I do draw upon the functionalists, and I also draw upon neuroscience. So I don't have one set answer, but I think that working in the interface between these different perspectives is most fruitful for us. However, we still have the problem of explaining how consciousness emerges in nature. And this brings us to the topic of emergence, which will be the subject of another lecture next week, when we talk about causality and we talk about free will and things like that. Finally, Nagel and Chalmers, Thomas Nagel and David Chalmers, are very interesting because they teach us to be humble in our accomplishments so far. We have not yet fully completed, the explanation of how mind emerges from reality. Thank you.